September 1946. The corner of 133rd Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem was a commercial intersection where several small businesses operated: a grocery store, a barber shop, a shoe repair shop, a small restaurant. On weekday mornings in early fall, the area was moderately busy with residents shopping for daily necessities before heading to work, men getting haircuts before job interviews or social events, women purchasing ingredients for evening meals. The grocery store on the southeast corner was a modest establishment called Patterson's Market, owned and operated by Harold Patterson, a white man in his mid-50s who had run the business since 1938. At 9:30 on this particular Tuesday morning in mid-September, Margaret Moultrie Johnson entered Patterson's Market to purchase a few items. Margaret was 73 years old, and a woman who had traveled from Charleston, South Carolina, to visit her son Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known throughout Harlem as Bumpy Johnson, who at 40 years old controlled the neighborhood's numbers rackets and wielded considerable power in Harlem's criminal economy. Margaret was a small woman, gray-haired, dressed in a modest navy blue dress and worn but clean shoes, carrying a cloth shopping bag. She moved slowly, her age evident in her careful gait and in the way she needed to lean close to shelves to read prices marked on cans and packages. Margaret selected several items: a small bag of flour, a tin of coffee, a box of sugar, some vegetables. She brought these items to the counter at the front of the store where Harold Patterson stood near the cash register. Patterson was a thick-set man with thinning brown hair, wearing a white apron over work clothes, his expression suggesting impatience with the slow-moving elderly woman who had taken several minutes to select her purchases. Patterson rang up the items and announced the total price: $2.47. Margaret opened a small coin purse and began counting out money carefully. 2 $1 bills, then quarters and dimes, counted slowly to reach the 47 cents. But after counting her coins twice, she appeared to be short. She had $2.42. She was missing a nickel. Margaret said quietly that she appeared to be 5 cents short, and asked if Patterson would allow her to return later in the day with the remaining 5 cents, or if he could remove one item from her purchase to bring the total within what she could pay. Her tone was respectful, her request reasonable. She was asking for accommodation of a trivial shortage, the kind of small courtesy that neighborhood merchants often extended to regular customers or to elderly residents who might have difficulty with exact change. Patterson's response was immediate and loud enough that several other customers in the store turned to observe what was happening. He said that he was not running a charity, that he expected payment in full for merchandise, that if she could not afford 5 cents, then perhaps she should not be shopping in his store. He said that people like her, and his emphasis on this phrase made clear he was referencing her race rather than her age or economic status, always expected special treatment, always wanted something for free, always thought rules did not apply to them. Margaret stood at the counter, her expression showing embarrassment and hurt. Other customers, all of whom were black residents of the neighborhood, watched this interaction with expressions that combined sympathy for Margaret and anger at Patterson's disrespectful treatment of an elderly woman over 5 cents. But no one intervened. Patterson owned the store and could refuse service to anyone, Challenging him directly would likely result in being barred from shopping there, which would be inconvenient since Patterson's Market was the closest grocery store for many residents in the immediate area. Margaret began putting the items back into her shopping bag, apparently planning to leave without purchasing anything since she could not pay the full amount. But at that moment, Bumpy Johnson entered the store. He had been walking past on Lenox Avenue. He had seen his mother enter Patterson's Market and had decided to stop in to see if she needed help carrying groceries back to his apartment. Johnson was 40 years old, a man of average height wearing a dark gray suit despite the warm September weather. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect and deference. As he entered the store, several customers recognized him immediately, and their expressions changed, some showing relief that someone with power had arrived, others showing concern about what might happen next. Johnson approached the counter and asked his mother what was happening. Margaret explained quietly that she was 5 cents short and that Mr. Patterson had said he could not extend credit or adjust the purchase. Johnson looked at Patterson, and Patterson's expression shifted from aggressive certainty to careful neutrality. He recognized Johnson, understood his position in the neighborhood, and suddenly realized that he had just insulted the mother of one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Harlem over 5 cents. Johnson reached into his pocket, removed a nickel, and placed it on the counter. He said nothing to Patterson. He picked up his mother's shopping bag, took her arm gently, and walked with her out of the store. His expression throughout this interaction had been completely neutral. No anger, no threats, no indication of how he was processing what had just occurred. He simply paid the 5 cents, collected the groceries, and left with his mother. As they walked north on Lenox Avenue toward Johnson's apartment, Margaret apologized for the embarrassment and explained that she had thought she had brought sufficient money but must have miscounted at home. Johnson told her not to be concerned about the 5 cents, that it was a trivial matter. But internally, Johnson was thinking carefully about what had just happened and what it revealed about conditions that extended far beyond one store owner's rudeness to one elderly woman. Harold Patterson's disrespectful treatment of Margaret Johnson over 5 cents was not primarily about the money or even about Margaret specifically. It was about power relationships that allowed white business owners in black neighborhoods to treat black customers with contempt while still expecting those customers to provide the revenue that sustained their businesses. Patterson felt entitled to humiliate an elderly black woman publicly because the economic structure of the neighborhood gave him that power. Residents needed groceries, Patterson's Market was conveniently located, and Patterson knew that individual customers would tolerate disrespect rather than face the inconvenience of shopping elsewhere. This dynamic was common throughout Harlem in 1946. Many businesses in the neighborhood were owned by white proprietors who did not live in Harlem, who viewed black customers primarily as sources of profit, and who felt no obligation to treat those customers with dignity or respect. These owners could be rude, could refuse service arbitrarily, could extend or deny credit based on personal preference rather than consistent policies, and could generally exercise power in ways that reinforced the subordinate status of black customers. Individual incidents of disrespect, like Patterson insulting Margaret over 5 cents, were symptoms of this larger structural reality. Responding to Patterson alone would address one symptom, but would not change the underlying conditions. What Johnson recognized as he walked his mother home was that the situation created an opportunity to demonstrate a different model of business ownership in Harlem, one where black proprietors could compete effectively with white-owned businesses and could treat customers with dignity while still operating profitably. Over the next several hours, as Margaret rested at Johnson's apartment and as Johnson conducted his regular business overseeing numbers operations, and Johnson began developing a strategy that would transform Patterson's disrespect into leverage for systemic change in how businesses operated in this section of Harlem. This strategy required understanding what resources would be needed to acquire and operate a grocery store, what obstacles Patterson might create to resist competition, and how Johnson could build support for a black-owned alternative to Patterson's market. The first step in developing this strategy was determining whether Patterson's market was financially stable and whether Patterson might be willing to sell. Johnson assigned two associates to make discreet inquiries about Patterson's business, reviewing public records about the property Lease, speaking with suppliers who delivered goods to the store, observing customer traffic patterns at different times of day. And within 48 hours, Johnson learned several useful facts. Patterson's market operated on thin profit margins. Patterson paid rent to a landlord who owned the building, paid suppliers for inventory, and employed two part-time workers who helped with stocking and cleaning. After expenses, Patterson's monthly profit was modest, approximately $300, enough to support Patterson and his family, but not enough to create substantial savings or financial security. The business was stable but not prosperous. Patterson had been trying unsuccessfully to sell the business for approximately 18 months. He wanted to retire and move to New Jersey, where his daughter lived, but he had found no buyers willing to pay the price he was asking. $8,000 for the business, including existing inventory, fixtures, and the right to assume the existing lease. The lack of buyers reflected the reality that running a small grocery store in Harlem required constant work for modest returns, which made it unattractive to potential purchasers who could find better opportunities elsewhere. The property where Patterson's market operated was owned by a landlord named Samuel Goldstein, who owned several buildings in Harlem and who charged Patterson rent of $125 per month under a lease that had 3 years remaining. Goldstein had a reputation as a reasonable landlord who maintained properties adequately and who was open to negotiating with reliable tenants. This information gave Johnson the foundation for a strategy that would achieve multiple objectives simultaneously: acquire Patterson's business and establish a black-owned grocery store at that location, demonstrate to other white business owners in Harlem that disrespecting black customers created consequences, and create a model that could be replicated by other black entrepreneurs throughout the neighborhood. To implement this strategy, Johnson began building a coalition of people who could provide different forms of support and expertise that would be necessary to acquire, establish, and operate a successful grocery store. The first ally Johnson recruited was Thomas Bradley, an attorney who handled legal matters for Johnson's organization. Bradley's role would be to structure the purchase of Patterson's business in ways that protected Johnson's interests, to negotiate with Goldstein about continuing the lease under new ownership, and to ensure that all necessary licenses and permits were obtained, and to address any legal challenges that might arise from establishing a black-owned grocery store at that location. Bradley had extensive experience with commercial real estate transactions and understood how to navigate the bureaucratic requirements that governed business operations in New York City. The second ally was Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen, who had retired from active management of numbers operations in the 1930s, but who maintained influence in Harlem's business community and who had expressed interest in supporting legitimate black-owned businesses. St. Clair's role would be to help identify someone who could manage the grocery store effectively, someone with retail experience, with understanding of inventory management and customer service, and with commitment to treating customers with dignity. St. Clair knew many people in Harlem's business community and could help recruit the right person for this management role. The third ally was Reverend Thomas Henderson, pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. Henderson was a respected community leader whose support would be valuable in encouraging residents to patronize the new black-owned grocery store rather than continuing to shop at other white-owned establishments in the area. Henderson's role would be to communicate to his congregation and to the broader community that supporting black-owned businesses was important for building economic power in Harlem, and that the new grocery store represented a model of business ownership that treated customers with respect. And the fourth ally was Dorothy Johnson, no relation to Bumpy Johnson, who had 20 years of experience managing a grocery store in Brooklyn before moving to Harlem in 1945. Dorothy was 52 years old, widowed, with adult children who lived in other parts of New York. She had been looking for an opportunity to manage or own a store, but had lacked the capital to purchase an existing business. Dorothy's role would be to serve as the manager and eventual owner of the grocery store, bringing her expertise in retail operations while representing the face of black entrepreneurship that the project was designed to demonstrate. With this coalition assembled, Johnson developed a detailed strategy for acquiring Patterson's business and establishing it under new ownership and management. And this strategy had several components that would unfold over the course of several weeks. The first component involved approaching Patterson about purchasing the business. Johnson had Thomas Bradley make the initial contact, presenting himself as representing a client who was interested in acquiring a grocery store in Harlem. Bradley did not initially disclose that Johnson was the client, calculating that Patterson might be more willing to negotiate if he believed he was dealing with a conventional business transaction rather than with someone he had recently insulted. Bradley met with Patterson at the store on a Thursday afternoon and explained that his client was interested in purchasing the business for the asking price of $8,000. Assuming that inspection of the inventory and financial records confirmed that the business was as represented. Patterson was surprised but pleased by this unexpected offer. He had been trying to sell for 18 months without success, and suddenly someone was offering to pay his full asking price without negotiation. Patterson asked who the buyer was. Bradley explained that his client preferred to remain anonymous until the transaction was completed, but that the buyer had sufficient capital and was serious about acquiring the business. Bradley presented a letter of intent that committed to purchasing the business for $8,000, subject to inspection and verification, with closing to occur within 30 days. Patterson agreed to this arrangement and provided Bradley with access to financial records, inventory lists, a supplier contracts, and other documentation that Bradley would need to complete due diligence. Over the following week, Bradley reviewed these materials and confirmed that Patterson's business was substantially as represented, modest but stable, with no hidden debts or undisclosed problems. The second component of the strategy involved negotiating with Samuel Goldstein about transferring the lease to new ownership. Bradley met with Goldstein and explained that his client was purchasing Patterson's market and would need to assume the existing lease for the remaining 3 years. Goldstein expressed concern about whether the new owner would be as reliable as Patterson had been in paying rent consistently and maintaining the property appropriately. Bradley provided financial references that demonstrated the buyer had substantial resources and would have no difficulty meeting rent obligations. He also proposed increasing the security deposit from 2 months' rent to 3 months' rent as additional assurance that Goldstein's interests would be protected. Goldstein agreed to transfer the lease to the new owner under these terms. The third component involved preparing Dorothy Johnson to assume management of the store. Johnson met with Dorothy and explained the opportunity. She would manage the grocery store for 6 months as a paid employee, earning $75 per week. After 6 months, if the store was operating successfully, and Dorothy would have the option to purchase ownership from Johnson for $4,000, half the original purchase price, paid through a loan that Johnson would provide at favorable terms. This arrangement gave Dorothy a clear path to business ownership while ensuring that the store would be managed competently during the critical transition period. Dorothy accepted this arrangement and began working with Bradley to obtain the necessary business licenses in her name, to establish relationships with suppliers who would provide inventory, and to develop plans for how the store would operate once ownership transferred. She also began recruiting 2 employees who would help with stocking, cleaning, and customer service. The fourth component involved communicating to the community about the upcoming change in ownership. Reverend Henderson announced at Sunday services that Patterson's market would soon be under new management, that the new owner was a black woman with extensive retail experience, and that the church community should support this black-owned business by shopping there rather than at competing stores owned by people who did not live in Harlem and who did not treat customers with appropriate respect. Henderson did not mention the incident between Patterson and Margaret Johnson, but many people in the congregation were aware of it through neighborhood gossip networks, and they understood that the change in ownership was connected to Patterson's disrespectful behavior. The fifth component involved the actual purchase transaction. 28 days after Bradley's initial meeting with Patterson, the closing occurred at Bradley's office. Johnson attended the closing but did not reveal to Patterson that he was the buyer until the moment when documents were being signed. When Patterson realized that he had sold his business to Bumpy Johnson, the man whose mother he had insulted over 5 cents 4 weeks earlier, his expression showed shock and fear. He understood immediately that the transaction was not simply a business deal, but was a consequence of his disrespectful behavior. Johnson said nothing to Patterson about the incident with Margaret. He simply completed the transaction professionally, signed the necessary documents, accepted the keys to the store, and departed. There were no threats, no recriminations, no commentary about Patterson's behavior. At the purchase itself was the message. Disrespecting Johnson's mother had cost Patterson his business and his livelihood in Harlem. Patterson left New York within the week and moved to New Jersey as he had planned. But instead of selling his business and retiring comfortably on the proceeds, He had sold to someone who would ensure that his departure from Harlem carried meaning beyond the simple transfer of property. On October 15, 1946, exactly 1 month after Patterson insulted Margaret Johnson over 5 cents, the store reopened under new ownership with a new name, Community Grocery. Dorothy Johnson was listed as the owner and manager. The store had been cleaned thoroughly, had been restocked with fresh inventory, and had signs in the windows announcing the change in ownership and inviting the community to support this black-owned business. And the response from the neighborhood was immediate and enthusiastic. Customers who had tolerated Patterson's rudeness for years now had an alternative where they could shop without expecting disrespect. Dorothy and her 2 employees treated customers with courtesy, extended small courtesies like allowing customers to be slightly short on payment with the understanding they would make up the difference on their next visit, and generally operated the store in ways that demonstrated respect for customers regardless of their economic status. Word spread quickly through Harlem that Bumpy Johnson had bought the store where his mother had been insulted and had installed black ownership and management. The story was told with various interpretations. Some emphasized Johnson's loyalty to his mother. Others emphasized his power to respond to disrespect with economic action. Still others emphasized the model of black business ownership that the transaction had created. Other white business owners in Harlem noticed the story and understood its implications. If a proprietor insulted someone connected to Bumpy Johnson, that proprietor might find himself forced to sell his business under circumstances not of his choosing. This understanding created incentives for more respectful treatment of customers, at least for those customers who might have connections to powerful figures in the community. But the more significant impact was on how the black community in Harlem thought about business ownership and economic power. Patterson's Market had been replaced by Community Grocery, demonstrating that black entrepreneurs could operate successful retail businesses that competed effectively with white-owned establishments. The success of Community Grocery encouraged other black residents to consider starting their own businesses, and it created a model that could be replicated in other neighborhoods. Over the following months, Dorothy Johnson operated Community Grocery successfully. Monthly revenue was comparable to what Patterson had achieved, but Dorothy reinvested profits into improving the store. Better lighting, cleaner displays, wider selection of products, rather than simply extracting maximum profit. After 6 months, as the original agreement specified, Dorothy exercised her option to purchase ownership from Bumpy Johnson for $4,000, financed through a loan with favorable terms that she repaid over 3 years from store profits. By 1949, Dorothy had paid off the loan and owned the store outright. She continued operating Community Grocery until 1962, when she sold it to another black entrepreneur and retired. The business remained under black ownership and continued serving the neighborhood for decades afterward. The immediate effect of Johnson's response to Patterson's insult was that one white business owner who had disrespected an elderly black woman was forced to leave Harlem, and his business was replaced by black ownership that treated customers with dignity. But the longer-term effect was the demonstration that economic power could be used to address disrespect in ways that created lasting change, rather than just temporary satisfaction. Johnson could have responded to Patterson's insult through violence or threats, approaches that would have been consistent with his reputation as a crime boss who did not tolerate disrespect. But such responses would have addressed the personal offense without changing the structural conditions that made Patterson's disrespect possible. By purchasing Patterson's business and establishing black ownership, Johnson addressed both the specific incident and the broader pattern of white business owners treating black customers with contempt. The transaction sent multiple messages simultaneously. To white business owners in Harlem, it demonstrated that disrespecting customers created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people with sufficient resources and strategic thinking. To the black community, it demonstrated that economic power could be built through business ownership and that supporting black-owned businesses was important for community development. To potential black entrepreneurs, it demonstrated that retail businesses could be successful under black management, and that opportunities existed for those willing to invest effort in building such enterprises. Reverend Henderson referenced the community grocery story in sermons over the following years as an example of how economic power could be used constructively to create change. He emphasized that supporting black-owned businesses was not just about individual convenience, but was about building collective economic strength that would give the community leverage in negotiations with outside interests. And he noted that community grocery demonstrated that black entrepreneurs could operate businesses as effectively as white owners while treating customers with greater respect and reinvesting profits in ways that benefited the neighborhood. Stephanie St. Clair, who had helped recruit Dorothy Johnson to manage the store, cited the community grocery model when encouraging other people in Harlem to start their own businesses. She emphasized that Johnson's investment in establishing black ownership had created a template that others could follow, and that building a network of black-owned businesses throughout Harlem would create economic power that would change relationships with white-owned establishments and with political structures that governed the neighborhood. Dorothy Johnson, who had managed and then owned community grocery, became a respected figure in Harlem's business community and served as a mentor to other black entrepreneurs who were starting retail businesses. She emphasized in conversations with aspiring business owners that the key to success was treating customers with respect, reinvesting profits to improve operations, and understanding that business ownership carried responsibility to the community beyond just generating personal income. For Bumpy Johnson himself, the purchase of Patterson's Market and its transformation into community grocery represented a different approach to exercising power than the violent enforcement of respect that characterized much of his criminal career. The transaction demonstrated that economic pressure could create outcomes that served his interests while also serving broader community interests, and that strategic thinking about how to use resources could generate leverage that violence alone could never achieve. Johnson's mother, Margaret, returned to Charleston after her visit to Harlem, but she maintained correspondence with her son and occasionally returned for additional visits. When she learned that her son had purchased the store where she had been insulted and had established it under black ownership, she expressed appreciation for his loyalty, but also noted that the transformation of the business was more valuable than any personal revenge could have been. Her insult had been converted into opportunity for lasting change. The story of how Bumpy Johnson bought the store where his mother was insulted over 5 cents became one of the defining narratives of his relationship with the Harlem community. It was told alongside stories about his distribution of Thanksgiving turkeys, his payment of rent for families in need, and his protection of community members from exploitation by outside interests. But the store purchase story had particular resonance because it demonstrated the intersection of personal loyalty with strategic thinking about economic development. The incident occurred in September 1946, when Johnson was 40 years old and at the height of his power in Harlem. He had controlled the numbers rackets since 1935, when he negotiated an agreement with Lucky Luciano that gave him operational independence in exchange for sharing profits with the Italian Mobile. Over 11 years, this arrangement had made Johnson wealthy and influential, and the store purchase demonstrated how that wealth and influence could be deployed for purposes beyond just maintaining criminal operations. The speed of the transaction, from insult to purchase completed within 1 month, demonstrated Johnson's capacity for decisive action when he chose to mobilize his resources. But the speed did not reflect impulsive emotional reaction. Rather, it reflected efficient execution of a strategy that Johnson had developed thoughtfully after recognizing that Patterson's disrespect created opportunity for systemic intervention. The fact that Johnson installed Dorothy Johnson as manager and eventual owner, rather than simply operating the store through his own organization, demonstrated understanding that the goal was establishing black business ownership, not expanding his personal empire. Johnson could have operated community grocery as another revenue stream for his criminal organization, but he recognized that the greater value was in creating a model of black entrepreneurship that others could replicate. The transaction also demonstrated Johnson's understanding of leverage and negotiation. By having Thomas Bradley approach Patterson without initially disclosing the buyer's identity, Johnson ensured that Patterson would negotiate based on the merits of the offer, rather than being influenced by fear of Johnson's reputation. This approach made the transaction legally clean and prevented Patterson from later claiming he had been coerced into selling. At the increased security deposit that Bradley negotiated with landlord Samuel Goldstein demonstrated attention to ensuring that the new black owner would be on solid footing with the landlord, reducing risk that Goldstein might use lease provisions to create problems for Dorothy Johnson later. This protective approach reflected Johnson's understanding that black business owners faced obstacles that white owners did not encounter, and that establishing black ownership required anticipating and addressing those obstacles proactively. The 6-month management period before Dorothy could exercise her option to purchase ownership demonstrated understanding that successful business ownership required proven capability rather than just desire. Dorothy needed to demonstrate that she could operate the store profitably before Johnson would transfer full ownership, creating accountability that protected both Johnson's investment and Dorothy's future success. These various elements of how the transaction was structured revealed the strategic sophistication that Johnson brought to the situation. He was not simply buying a store to punish Patterson for insulting his mother. He was creating a comprehensive model for black business development that addressed multiple objectives: personal loyalty, economic development, community respect, demonstration of consequences for disrespecting black residents. The legacy of the transaction extended beyond just community grocery's success. The story influenced how other black residents in Harlem thought about their relationship to white-owned businesses and to economic power more broadly. Before the community grocery story, many residents had accepted as inevitable that white business owners would control commercial activity in the neighborhood and that black residents would be customers but not proprietors. The story demonstrated that this arrangement was not inevitable, that black ownership was possible, and that supporting black-owned businesses was important for building community power. The story also influenced how white business owners in Harlem approached their relationships with black customers. The knowledge that disrespectful treatment could create consequences, not just loss of individual customers, but potential loss of the entire business, created incentives for more courteous behavior. This did not eliminate racism or transform all white-owned businesses into models of respectful service, but it established that blatant disrespect carried risks that prudent business owners would avoid. For black entrepreneurs in Harlem and in other cities where the story circulated, community grocery became a reference point for conversations about business ownership. Aspiring entrepreneurs could point to Dorothy Johnson's success as evidence that retail businesses could thrive under black ownership, and could reference the model that Bumpy Johnson had established for supporting such ownership through strategic investment. And the story had particular resonance in the context of the Great Migration and the developing civil rights movement. Millions of black people had moved from the South to northern cities between 1910 and 1950, seeking economic opportunities and escape from Jim Crow oppression. But northern cities presented their own forms of discrimination and exploitation, including the pattern of white business owners extracting wealth from black neighborhoods while treating black customers with disrespect. Community grocery represented a different model, one where economic power remained within the community and where business relationships reflected mutual respect. As the civil rights movement developed momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, community grocery and similar black-owned businesses represented the economic dimension of demands for equality. Political rights were important, but economic power was also necessary for genuine equality. The story of how Bumpy Johnson had responded to his mother's insult by creating black business ownership rather than seeking violent revenge illustrated how economic strategy could achieve outcomes that political or legal action alone might not accomplish. When Johnson died in July 1968, the obituaries and tributes that appeared in Harlem newspapers included references to community grocery alongside mentions of his criminal career and his charitable activities. The store purchase was remembered as an example of how Johnson had used his power and resources to benefit the community, even while operating outside the law in other aspects of his life. Dorothy Johnson, who had managed and then owned community grocery, attended Johnson's funeral at Abyssinian Baptist Church. She stood with thousands of other Harlem residents who came to acknowledge Johnson's death and to recognize his complex legacy. In conversations after the funeral, Dorothy told people that Bumpy Johnson had given her the opportunity to become a business owner at a time when few such opportunities existed for black women, and that his investment had changed her life and had created a model that influenced many others. Margaret Johnson, Bumpy's mother, had died in 1951, 5 years after the incident at Patterson's Market. Before her death, she had returned to Harlem several more times and had shopped at community grocery, where Dorothy always treated her with special courtesy and respect. And Margaret had told Dorothy that she was grateful not just that her son had responded to the insult, but that he had responded in a way that created something lasting rather than just punishing Patterson temporarily. The transformation of Patterson's market into community grocery represented a pattern that appeared repeatedly in how Johnson exercised power. The recognition that sustainable influence came from creating value and addressing systemic issues rather than from simply punishing individuals or extracting maximum profit. Johnson could have used his power purely for personal enrichment and for maintaining dominance through fear. But repeatedly throughout his career, he chose approaches that built community support and that created outcomes benefiting others alongside his own interests. The store purchase was one example among many, but it had particular symbolic power because it began with such a small trigger, 5 cents and an insult to an elderly woman, and escalated into systemic economic intervention that changed business ownership patterns in that section of Harlem. The disproportionate response demonstrated that Johnson understood leverage and understood that small incidents could create opportunities for large impacts if addressed strategically. Decades after the events of September 1946, when people in Harlem told the story of how Bumpy Johnson bought the store where his mother was insulted over 5 cents, they emphasized several lessons that remained relevant long after the specific incident had passed. The story taught that disrespecting community members created consequences that extended beyond individual relationships to economic and structural changes. It taught that wealth could be used strategically to create lasting change rather than just temporary satisfaction. It taught that supporting black-owned businesses was important for building economic power. It taught that patient strategic thinking could achieve outcomes that immediate emotional reactions could never accomplish. The story also taught that some of the most significant exercises of power occurred through transactions that created value rather than through conflicts that destroyed value. Johnson could have destroyed Patterson through violence or through business sabotage that would have driven Patterson into bankruptcy without compensating him. But by purchasing Patterson's business at fair market value and converting it to black ownership, Johnson achieved his objectives while also creating a successful business that served the community for decades afterward. This approach to power, creating value while achieving strategic objectives, became a model that influenced how subsequent generations of black entrepreneurs and community leaders thought about economic development. The focus shifted from simply demanding better treatment from white-owned businesses to creating black-owned alternatives that competed effectively while treating customers with dignity. Community grocery demonstrated that this approach was viable and could succeed. The story's emphasis on the role of disrespect as the trigger for economic intervention also taught lessons about the relationship between dignity and power. Patterson's insult to Margaret Johnson over 5 cents was economically trivial but symbolically significant. It represented the broader pattern of white business owners treating black customers as subordinate despite depending on those customers for revenue. By responding with economic power that transformed ownership patterns, Johnson demonstrated that dignity had value that transcended immediate financial calculations. The transformation of one store could not solve all problems related to economic inequality or racist disrespect in Harlem, but it established a precedent and created a model that others could reference. When subsequent incidents occurred where black residents were disrespected by white business owners, and the community grocery story provided a framework for understanding how strategic economic responses could create lasting change. When black entrepreneurs needed examples of successful black-owned retail businesses, community grocery stood as proof that such success was achievable. The quiet nature of how the transaction unfolded, no public confrontation, no dramatic announcements, just efficient execution of a purchase followed by installation of new ownership, became part of the story's meaning. Power exercised quietly and strategically could be more effective than power exercised through public spectacle. The restraint Johnson showed in not humiliating Patterson publicly, instead simply completing a business transaction, demonstrated confidence that the outcome spoke for itself without requiring theatrical emphasis. When Thomas Bradley, the attorney who had structured the transaction, reflected years later on the community grocery deal, he emphasized that it represented one of the clearest examples he had witnessed of how criminal wealth could be converted into community benefit. Johnson had used money generated from illegal numbers operations to purchase a legitimate business that provided employment, served community needs, and created a model for black entrepreneurship. This conversion of criminal proceeds into productive community assets was not unique to the community grocery transaction, but it was one of the most visible and comprehensible examples. The story of the store purchase became permanently intertwined with the story of Bumpy Johnson's relationship with Harlem. It illustrated the complexity of his legacy. A violent criminal who also created community benefits, a figure who operated outside the law but who enforced codes of respect and dignity, a person whose power came partly from fear but also partly from strategic actions that served community interests. The store purchase was one of many incidents that contributed to this complex portrait, but it had particular resonance because it began with such a relatable trigger, a mother insulted in a store, and ended with such a clear outcome, new ownership that changed how that business operated. The legacy was that power could be exercised to create change rather than just to punish disrespect, that economic strategy could achieve outcomes that violence alone could never accomplish, and that supporting black business ownership was important for building community power that would outlast any individual leader. These lessons remained relevant long after Bumpy Johnson died, long after community grocery passed to subsequent owners, long after the specific incident that triggered the transaction had faded from immediate memory. The pattern established by the transaction influenced how people thought about economic power and about the relationship between personal loyalty and strategic community development.